Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Ties 2.0, featured on the Whole Care Network and UKHealthRadio.com, the world's #1 talk health radio. I'm your host and presenter, Christopher McClellan. You just might know me as the Bowtie Guy. On Healing Ties 2.0, we visit with people from all over the globe who share their stories, because it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. And our common cause is supporting caregivers before, during, and after caregiving ends. And caregiving is just not a local issue. Caregiving is an emotional issue, and it's a universal issue which brings people together from diverse backgrounds. And we believe the best information and referral comes from caregivers who share their stories, knowledge, and experiences with each other, which helps build a global network of care. Let me set the stage today for our special guest, because you might be thinking, leadership from the pub? What is all that about? And what does leadership have to do with caregiving? Well, I have to say everything. Now 7 years past my caregiving experience, and after earning a master's degree in leadership and communication, I firmly believe caregiving in and of itself is all about leadership and communication. The caregiver is the leader of the care team, rather the CEO, and is the responsibility of everyone on the care team to communicate effectively, especially in the midst of a crisis. But how do we do that? Well, my special guest today and long-standing friend of 20-plus years, Irvine Nugent, has seen firsthand how any new business skill won't be effective unless it's paired with true emotional intelligence. Irvine spent the majority of his career helping leaders and organizations and people like me harness the power of their emotions in powerful ways to create deeper connections, make more informed and level-headed decisions, and increase their influence throughout their career and their life. Remember, caregiving is an emotional experience. And to top that off, Irvine was born in Northern Ireland, and his richly varied background brings a true, unique perspective every time he speaks. Having grown up in a society torn apart by a dramatic period of violence and division, Irvine has seen the worst of what can happen when communication breaks down and people fail to listen and understand each other or manage conflict. This formed the foundation of his desire to help people communicate and listen better with one another throughout the world. Irvine helps people harness the power of their emotions so that they can have deeper connections, make better decisions, and increase their influences. He is internationally recognized trainer and top-rated keynote speaker, and is one of the few worldwide certified fax coders who are experts in reading facial emotions. A gifted storyteller, his programs are infused with passion and, of course, his natural Irish humor. He's the author of the book, Leadership Lessons from the Pub, and he also happens to be one of my most trusted friends for over 20 years. Let's join our conversation. Well, greetings, Irvine, and welcome to Healing Ties 2.0. It is an honor to visit with you today. We have such a long and rich history and friendship, and to be able to have you on as a guest today is just a thrill for me. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Chris. The honor indeed is mine. And as you say, our paths crossed many, many years ago. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today and sharing and catching up a little bit.
Yeah, it's been over 20 years if I do the math correct. Time flies, and you've been such a good friend for so long. But I have to ask you, as I ask all my guests, Irvine, how are you creating Healing Ties?
That's such a great question. You know, I think, Chris, one of the things that I've realized perhaps later in my life is that healing ties have really been part of my DNA. And growing up in a society of conflict, I think it placed in my heart a desire to be a healer. And I think one of the ways I've always tried to respond to help people create ties. Right. And I do that presently, working with leaders and organizations and helping them embrace the power of their emotions and to be a presence that creates connection and builds human workplaces.
Very well said, because that's how I've always known you, as somebody who is a bridge builder, somebody that reaches out and creates healing ties. And I know, especially for our listeners in the UK, I'd just be delighted for you to share about your experience in growing up in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, it is, Chris. I am classically known. They actually give my generation a name. We are children of the Troubles. I was born in 1967, and the Troubles in Northern Ireland started around that, and it was a backdrop to really growing up. And my family were very intimately affected by that, in that when I was 6, I grew up in a pub, and our house was above the pub. And when I was 6, the pub and the house was destroyed in a terrorist bombing. And we were literally left with the clothes on our back. Everything was destroyed. And while that is a story of disaster, it's also an incredible story of resilience, because my parents were 2 amazing human beings.
Yes.
Who taught us the power of resilience, and the power to recreate yourself, and the power to get yourself up and to create an optimistic future. And I think I've come to appreciate that more and more as I grow older.
What an experience at age 6. Mm-hmm. And as people, and we'll certainly get to your book, but when I went through the book and I saw the pictures, and I don't know if I have this quote verbatim, but I think your dad said, "Watch me rebuild."
Yeah. Yeah. So one of my memories is, of course, I was 6. And so I just remembered being picked up in the bed. And my dad, the IRA had gone in. They had placed a bomb on the counter. And so they'd given us 5 minutes. And my dad ran up to get my 4 sisters out and my mother out of the building. And I was asleep. He picked me up. He ran down the stairs across the street. And at that stage, the bomb went up. And my abiding memory of that moment is my dad raising a clenched fist and saying, "Watch me build again." And it's this deep guttural, response that we will rebuild.
And he rebuilt and rebuilt. And the story is utterly amazing, and I appreciate you sharing bits of it. But I also know, as I've had the pleasure of knowing you for so long, that really formed you and your desire to help others.
It did. When you grow up in a society that turns tribal, you have a choice, I think. And my parents kind of sewed that into, what is your choice? And the choice is you just go deeper and deeper into the tribalism and your side. And, every side, both sides had their narrative, their explanation of history. Or you decide that you're going to build bridges and not walls. And I think part of me always had yearned, it's kind of this deep thing. There has to be better than this. The human person is capable of such amazing feats that we can't descend into pure violence and hatred. And so part of me did that. I mean, primarily, I think as I look back at the different episodes of my life, I've done it in different ways. The first response was as a Catholic priest, as 10 years. And part of that very much was this desire to bring healing into people and to help people truly embrace the power of their potential.
And one of your superpowers, as I've watched you over the years, is your ability to share stories and heal people through story sharing.
Mm-hmm. One of the blessings of being brought up in a pub, and I bring this out in the book, which is called Leadership Lessons from the Pub. I was brought up in a diet of story. And the Irish have a beautiful saying for a storyteller. The Irish call the person the Shanachie. And there's no real translation in English, but one of the best ways you can translate it, I think, is the keeper of the memory, the keeper of the tradition. So here you have this keeping of the tradition. And as I look back, my father, but especially my Aunt Betty, oh my God, talk about a woman that was a storyteller. So you grow up in this great diet of story after story after story. And that just was instilled within me. And the power to touch people through our story, and it's such, the only word I have for it is sacred. It is this ability to touch the emotions, to invite people, and what we know now from neuroscience is that we just don't listen to stories. We experience them as if we're in them. That's why Hollywood is so successful. Right. And in telling your story, we get on board a flight simulator and we live that story with you. And that's, talk about powerful ways to connect with other people. So story just has this innate ability to create connection.
Yeah, it could be, because it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on common causes.
Absolutely. When you think about it, you can get, mentally, you can think about something and understand it. But through story, not only do you do that, but you also create an emotional connection. And you get to experience what it's like to be in the shoes of another person. And when you do that, then it creates an opening in the heart. And that's, of course, where diversity lives. That's where the power to create connection lives. And that's really powerful.
One of the stories that I always like to share with our listeners, and I think probably they're going to say, well, he's going to tell that story again. But I am, because I'm not sure you and I have had the chance to talk about it. And the story really relates to your book. I recall back when I was doing my research for my thesis, and came across the story about a new employee at a major corporation. And if I remember correctly, he was working in the lunchroom. And it was his first day or two, and he finds himself at a table sitting by himself, and who sits down? Well, the CEO next to him. These two people didn't have anything in common. That small talk that we try to make with people that we don't really know. And then you hit on a topic that you have some common interest. And for this person and the CEO, was the new employee was taking care of his wife in a caregiving situation. And the CEO was taking care of his mother. All of a sudden, they had common ground, and they were as diverse as they could be, but they had something that they could talk about, and they learned a little bit about each other. And from there, they could forge a friendship. It talks about the power of sharing our story and how, not only how cathartic it is, but how it helps other people understand who you are.
Yeah, Chris, that's really interesting, because one of the things that I bring out in the book is, one of the questions is, the book's called Leadership Lessons from the Pub, and people go, well, what's got leadership got to do with the pub?
I was going to ask that. We're going to get to that too. So,
But one of the things that the pub does fantastically well is that it creates a space where story thrives.
Right.
And when story thrives, you can bring together the CEO, you can bring together the carpenter, you can bring together the fisher person, you can bring all the different people who, on the face of it, have no connection whatsoever.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, through these unknown ties, connection is made, and it's so powerful. And it's connections in the heart, which is, and that's what creates such a powerful experience.
Because when you connect the heart, that's what binds people together.
Absolutely.
I just think story sharing is so powerful, whether it's in especially in the workplace, and it's been powerful through our advocacy as caregivers that because it, like you just said, it connects diverse people together. You have that freedom to be yourself.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you shine light on experiences that perhaps otherwise don't come to light. So it's more than, like in this example, I'm not just a caregiver. Here's my human experience. Here's what I'm living. And journey with me for a few minutes on that experience. And when we get into that level, it begins to change everything.
And then we find out that we're really not all that much different.
No. I always say that, scratch below the surface, and our pains and our hurts and our challenges and our dreams and our hopes and our passions are so alike.
Very much so. But let's dig into this a little bit deeper about how does leadership and the pub connect?
So I've worked with leaders practically my whole adult life, and primarily now in the last, say, 10 or 15 years through a lot of leadership executive coaching. And as I sat there with leaders who I believe are courageous people, it's an act of courage today to be a leader. Yes. Because there's many stones that are willing to be thrown at you. So to stand up and say, I'm going to lead, is a courageous act.
Right.
And just listening to their struggles and listening to them trying to create places where people felt they wanted to belong, where people felt that their potential was realized, that their diversity was respected.
Right.
And so then it brought me to this notion is the pub has been doing this for hundreds of years. Here you have this space where people voluntarily go, where they call it their local, where people are vulnerable in the sense of, when you go to a pub, you don't have to put on your airs and your graces. It's warts and all. You tell stories of daily life and the struggles. And I say there's a lot of lessons in the pub for leadership. And one of the surprises in the research for the book was that there's been very little sociological research on this phenomena of the pub. And you would think otherwise.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so the more I thought about it, I think there's some very powerful lessons and clues for leaders into how to build what I call more human places to work in.
Right. Irvine, I'd be interested in your feedback on this because I kind of see a connection here with servant leadership.
It's a really fascinating question. My father used to say, I'm not in the business of serving drinks. I'm in the business of creating a home. And, that reality of I love that image of the innkeeper. The innkeeper is the person that provides respite to the weary traveler. And I think leadership is about that. Leadership is the person that leaders do two things very well. They are able to assess where their employees are at and when they're in need of respite, the weariness of work at times. And then they're able to create and send them off to build upon their talent and potential. So they do those, and all of that is about the servant. It's about the listening. It's about being in touch of where people are at. It's about being acutely aware of the power of a word or an encouragement. And it's less about what the leader does and more about how the leader is and how present they are.
Goodness, because I see a strong connection as it relates to servant leadership and which I love, and we're going to get into the emotional intelligence as well. But I've always looked at caregiving in a sense, caregivers as being leaders who often don't know how to lead because of the emotion, that stress that they're under. And I think in wrapping this around, detecting our emotions, you talk so eloquently about this in the book, our emotional intelligence. And I'd love for you to expound on that for our listeners.
We're human beings, and an integral part, what makes us uniquely human, is our emotional experience. And so often our emotions are sometimes presented as negative. Like when you say to a person, don't get too emotional, or you're very emotional about this. And it's like, so it's almost like, oh, those nasty emotions. And I always like to say, as human beings, we are created with one purpose, and that's to survive. And our emotions are there to help us. They're here to help us survive. They're there to provide information. And so part of our emotional life is to go into strategies to help us survive when we're under attack, or also when we're in need of help. The whole emotion of sadness has a unique configuration in the face. And what happens when you see sadness in a person's face is that it touches another person's heart and you want to respond because this is a cry for help. So our emotional life there. So to be able to understand your emotions, to be able to understand these amazing messages that our body is telling us, and then to be able to be aware of that and to read it in others, I call it's a superpower because it leads to a new level of communication, which allows deeper ties and allows more powerful bonding. And so both professionally and socially. So we know that people with higher emotional intelligence are more successful in the workplace. And we know people with higher emotional intelligence have deeper and more satisfying relationships generally, and especially at home.
How can people become more aware of their emotional intelligence?
So it's a great question. So I got great news for everyone. Great news.
Very good.
And the great news is that you can work on your emotional intelligence if you're 6 or if you're 96. The emotional intelligence, there's never a moment in our lives when we can't grow it. So I would just say, this is the key to great leadership. The key to great relationships is to work on your self-awareness. So how do you grow? Take some time and begin to ask some just really basic questions about, what am I feeling in the moment? Can I provide words around that? And so what I like to say is sometimes our emotional literacy is some people have it better than others. And so sometimes the only emotions we can name are 2 or 3. And for others, they have a very rich emotional life and they're more nuanced. But no matter where you're at, it's to take time to think about, even to reflect at the end of the day, what happened today? What were some of the emotions that I was feeling today? And to really think about that and to begin to notice patterns in our life and begin to notice what we're feeling, because I think that gives powerful messages to us, both in how we want to interact with other people and in the needs that we have.
And I would imagine, because I have had to do some soul searching myself in my 64th year, knowing our triggers, our personal triggers of what sets off our emotions, because I think we all have them, but sometimes let's see if I get these words put together correctly, we react before we think, because something triggers us that we've left either unsaid or we've not previously dealt with before.
Yeah. I can come up with a word, and the word is trigger print. They said, we're very familiar with our fingerprint.
I like that.
Yeah. So we know that everyone's fingerprint is unique and it's identified. Well, our trigger prints are unique. We may have some similar triggers, but because of my unique upbringing, because of my experience, my trigger print is going to be very different from you. One of my triggers is when I see a police flashing lights behind me, brings me back to my childhood and causes extreme anxiety. And that's still to today. That's part of growing up. It's mine. For others, it may be a person who triggers you. It may be something someone says to you. It may be talked down to. It may be talked over. Whatever it is. And it's possible to study these and to become more aware of them. And when we're more aware, then we have the ability to choose how we react and choose and manage those.
I guess that's probably why it's real important for each one of us to know our own conflicts and our own conflict stories, and what really, go back to that. I love that. What's our trigger print?
Yep, absolutely. Because, in many ways it can help us prepare. I mean, I was working with a client about 6 months ago. One of her triggers was that when someone spoke over her, she just shut down. It went back to some childhood memories of being spoken over. And she was a very successful businesswoman, but this was triggering her. And she began to notice the patterns, and we began working on that. And once you notice those patterns, then, and especially if they happen, so this was every Wednesday, the same person would shut her down. And so then we began to imagine other ways of reacting that would be less limiting and would enable her to feel more empowered.
And it's all within our power to change.
Yes. We're the only people we can change. If we get down the fool's game of trying to change someone else, we'll rarely be successful. But we always have the opportunity to change ourselves, and each day is a new opportunity to learn more about ourselves. And the great thing about, Chris, I like to say about emotional intelligence is if you have the humility and the curiosity, if you have the curiosity to realize that as we get older, there's always more to learn about ourselves and others. And then if we have the humility to realize that we don't know everything and that we're always learning more about ourselves.
I'd be curious to put you on the spot here just for a second and ask you, in this terrific research and field that you're in, If you could look back 30 years
Mm-hmm.
from your life, what's different today than then?
I think for myself, I have become more acutely aware of how my childhood created in me a need for safety. And that many of my decisions were driven about being safe and protecting myself, and how that impacted me perhaps taking more risk in my life in a good way and challenge.
Yeah.
And so now I think I do. Now, maybe that's the process of getting older. I say things that perhaps I wouldn't have said before. This ability to realize that, oh, that's the old safety story coming out, you know?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's my need for being safe, and perhaps what I really need to do is be a little more courageous.
I think it's safe to say we could all use a little bit more courage from time to time. Looking back 30 years for myself, I can't ask you the question without answering it myself. I wish I would have had a little bit more courage in my 30s as I do in my 60s. And maybe that is aging or knowing yourself better. But I think we have the capability in our 30s to be aware of our emotional intelligence and apply it appropriately. As I look back on 30 years, I wish I'd had a little bit more understanding or awareness of how I reacted to things, because there's so many things I would have liked to have responded to differently because I was just not self-aware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chris, just to have the humility to be able to say that is huge, I think. To be able to say that I now am more aware of patterns. I'm more aware of things in the past that I wish I had said. And the great thing about it is today's a new day and a new opportunity.
It kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with one of the caregiving groups. And I forget exactly what we were talking about, but I said, and we were talking about parents. And I said, well, you know, one of the blessings about getting older is that as I've gotten older, I was able to recognize some of my traits of my parents in me, and it was easier to forgive them.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes. I've become more appreciative of my parents.
Right.
And just some of the wisdom that, of course, that as a teenager I never saw or appreciated. And with age, hopefully comes wisdom and appreciation.
And gray hairs come too, but kind of like the gray hairs. I don't know about you.
Yes, indeed. Yep. No, lots of them.
One of the parts of your book that I really enjoyed, and you talked about the 4 dimensions of emotional intelligence, and I think it kind of applies to what we've just been talking about.
Emotional intelligence is a term. You know, people say, well, what's it about?
What
and I
is
said,
it?
The best way is just, it's really the ability in 4 aspects to be able to do them. Number 1 is self-awareness. Mm-hmm. So number 1 is the ability to be aware of the emotions as they are happening, your emotional triggers, what is happening with you. And of course, the body physiologically very often will send us messages before they register in the mind. So that acute awareness. Then it's self-management. So we become aware. We know we're triggered. We know we're angry. We know, et cetera, all those different things. Then what do? Do we have a toolkit? Do we have practical tools that we can manage those emotions and direct them? And so that the emotions are not directing us, we're directing the emotions. And then the third thing is being aware of others. So are we aware of others' emotions? Are we aware of what they're going through? Are we aware of their triggers? Can we read their emotions? And then finally, relationship management. How can we manage then, use all this information to manage the relationship so that the outcome is what we desire? And it doesn't go to a place perhaps that we don't want it to go, but that we're able to manage all those different things that are happening and to be able to have a successful outcome in any dialogue or any conversation.
And these tools can be used in the workplace. It can be used in our conversation with our friends and family. And these conversations can be used by caregivers as they're talking with their care team, physicians, nurses, everybody.
Absolutely.
It's becoming more self-aware.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in the caregiving role. Because so often there are so many frustrations. I just know that from, my sisters who spent many years with caregiving with my mother. There are so many frustrations, and very often, especially when we're talking, say, to a doctor or medical staff, etc., we can get so caught up in those that we don't ask what we really need to ask. We don't get to what we want. And just to be aware of perhaps of a trigger or a frustration, and just to be aware of that and say, okay, let me do some breathing. Let me do a technique that will help me then be able to get to an outcome that I want, which is a specific aspect of a conversation or information that I need. All of that is really critical.
Because caregiving in and of itself is an emotional experience.
Absolutely.
And
highly stressful.
High stressful. And then when you combine that with a family caregiver who's working full time, and trying to manage their job, which is critical, their caregiving role, there's just a whole set of tools here that the caregiver and the manager can use to come to common ground.
Absolutely, yeah. And then the other thing as well, exhaustion comes into play as well.
Right.
So often we have this chronic lack of sleep, and because of all the different roles. And then, of course, that impacts our emotional intelligence. It impacts our ability to be present in the moment. So that the humility to know and the forgiveness to know, I'm just tired. And to know this awareness, like today I'm exhausted. And so therefore it is going to be more difficult for me to manage my emotions. It's going to be more difficult for me not to respond, etc., in the way that I might want. So all that awareness plays in.
Isn't it funny how it comes full circle, as we talked earlier in the show about sharing the stories, and when we find out that we have similar experiences, it's a little bit easier to understand where we're coming from and how we can proactively deal with the emotions and the struggles.
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Well, what a delightful conversation, but I think this is a great time for us to take our break. Now, I have to prepare you, Irvine. And when we come back from the break, I'm going to want to know one fun fact about you that I don't know. And this is going to be, this should be interesting because I think I know pretty much, but you never know what we're going to find out. So let's take our break. You're listening to Healing Ties 2.0 on UK Health Radio, the world's #1 talk health radio. We'll be right back.
Everyone has a story, but not everyone gets a chance to share their story. So we're going to give you that chance. We want to hear about your story. We want to know how you're creating healing ties in your life and in your community. Email the bow tie guy at healingties.com and indicate if you'd like to be a guest on the show in order to tell your story. To your health, happiness and prosperity.
Coming up next week on Healing Ties on UK Health Radio.
You don't get through cancer. You don't get through almost dying from your kidneys failing. It's a family. It is a lot of people that love you and care for you that are all around you. And my daughter, who was 21 years at the time when my kidneys failed, after 2 years of dialysis, she gave me the most beautiful, selfless gift in the world to her dad. I call her my courageous angel.
Be sure to join us next week for a beautiful and heartwarming conversation with Jeff Stadinsky as he tells his story of surviving cancer and receiving a kidney transplant from his daughter and how he is spreading hope to those who are facing cancer diagnosis. Well, welcome back, everybody. We are continuing our wonderful conversation with Irvine Nugent, my good friend Irvine Nugent of 20-some-odd years and a couple of waistlines ago. But
How true that is.
enough said there. But and I think I had hair on the top of my head too at that time. But that's all.
I remember those days. Yes,
You remember
I do.
those days?
I
Very
do. I do.
Goodness. But as I mentioned to you before the break, Irvine, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
I'd like to know one fun fact about you that I may not know, and I know our listeners are sitting on the edge of their chair wanting to know.
Oh, dear. Well, I don't know if this will be fun enough, but here's one that comes to mind. When I was releasing the book, and there's a picture of me with a pint of Guinness. My local in D.C. is called Kirwan's. It's in Washington, D.C. Great Mark Kirwan, Irish guy, got his pub there. When I was shooting the cover, they said, well, you need to pour a pint. And I said, well, what do you mean I need to pour a pint? I haven't poured a pint for 40 years. I said, and pouring a pint is a very stressful thing. It's done right
art.
or it's not. It's an art.
It's an art.
So I had a little audience of people looking at me, so the pressure was on. And so I poured the pint, and actually it was pretty good. And so I gave it to the barman, and he tasted it, and he said, that'll pass. And I said, okay, I'll take a pass any day on 30 years. So my fun fact is I can still pour a pretty good pint of Guinness. So if you invite me and there's a keg of Guinness, I'm the man. I can pour you a pint.
You're the man.
Yeah. There you go.
Well, I would have to, when we can start traveling again, I would have to come up to D.C.
Totally.
I've been to D.C. in ages, and we'll have to go to the pub.
Yes, we will. That'd be wonderful. We'll have a great old time.
We'll share some wonderful stories and catch up. And goodness, it has been too long.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What would you say to our listeners who are thinking about being more self-aware of their emotional intelligence and how they can transmit that to others? What suggestions would you have?
So here's a few. We live in pandemic times, and we've come used now to this image of this invisible pandemic and the impact of that and how we can catch it. Well, long before the pandemic, our emotions are contagious. We catch each other's emotions.
Right.
And I always say to people, be very deliberate and methodical about what emotions you're sowing. And that's an amazing power you have. What mood am I sowing today? So I would just say some simple things that listeners can do is just take a little time to check in with yourself. To check in what's happening in your life today and what mood are you in? What's some of the emotions? And is that an emotion you want to sow? Because whether you intended to or not, people are going to catch it.
Right.
And you may just need to make a little adjustment. My website is there's a lot of different free resources there, but there's one that's called the 7-second reset. It's a great way of just 7 seconds, just resetting your mood. And just put your feet in the ground for second 1, seconds 2, 3, and 4, breathe in. Just notice what's happening in your body. And seconds 5, 6, and 7, breathe out. And just adjust and to just be more aware of where you're at in the moment. So that's one thing. And then just the second thing is very often we talked a little bit about caregiving, coming home and going to work. And I know a lot of us now are working from home, but we're going to be back at work pretty soon. And I always say those are two important thresholds. That to be very cognizant of what we're bringing to work and what we're returning home with. And just to take a couple of minutes to check in with yourself. Once again to say, what am I bringing home? Is this what I want to bring home? Do I need a little adjustment? And what am I bringing to work? And is this how I want to show up? And it's those little moments of just taking check-in times to be more, because we live in a life of such hurry and it's becoming more rapid. And those check-in moments are incredibly powerful and can really change how people experience us and how we experience others.
I think I'm going to change my theory from caregivers a 5-second daily intention for themselves to setting a 7-second daily intention for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And one final thought before we go, and I am going to steal this from you. Well, not steal it, borrow it. Chief Storyteller Officer, Irvine Nugent.
Yes.
I've known that about you for over 20 years. and it is an honor to be your friend.
Well, likewise, Chris. Likewise. This has been an honor and a pleasure.
So let all our listeners know how they can find your book and your website. Your videos on your website are spectacular. Let everybody know how they can be in touch with you.
Sure. So everything is linked to my name, which is Irvine Nugent. So my website is irvinenugent.com. There you'll find there's a irvinenugent.com/book. Gives you all the information about leadership lessons from the pub. You can buy it on Amazon, etc. There's a free chapter there. Every week I come up with a new video on emotional intelligence on YouTube. So feel free to follow me on YouTube. It's an educational video, about 10 minutes long. And then also I have a free gift as well, which is a little introductory course on emotional intelligence and some wonderful tools that we've talked about today. And you can get that at irvinenugent.com/gift. And feel free to take that. It's a little online course, and it introduces you to all the concepts of emotional intelligence and some of the great tools that we've talked about, and just really helping you become more aware and giving you some tools to manage those emotions.
And I've started the course, and it's quite terrific. And I can't thank you enough for spending the time with us today to share your wisdom with all of our listeners. Thanks, Irvine.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I thoroughly enjoyed reconnecting and visiting with Irvine today, and I encourage you to visit Irvine at irvinenugent.com and pick up a copy of his book of Leadership Lessons from the Pub. You will not be disappointed. Well, thanks for joining us today for this episode of Healing Ties, and if you would like to share your story on Healing Ties, email me direct at thebowtieguy@healingties.com. We would love to share your story on Healing Ties. As you know, I'm your host and presenter, Christopher McClellan. I've created a life to love after caregiving ends by being with awesome people like you. And be sure to subscribe to Healing Ties wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. We'll see you for another episode of Healing Ties real soon. Bye for now.